One action. Hey guys, welcome back to Keeping It 99, the most edifying podcast in the world. And I'm joined here today with Ann Saweris. Thank you, Ann, for coming onto the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So before we get started, can we get a bio about who you are, what you do?
Yeah. So my name is Ann. I grew up here in Charlotte, North Carolina. I went to St. Mark's Coptic Orthodox Church my entire life. Just graduated from UNC. Go Heels about like a week ago. Majored in neuroscience, minored in both chemistry and music. And yeah, here we are.
Well, congratulations on graduating.
Thank you.
And today's topic is the church and politics. So my first question for you is, what role do you think the church plays in politics?
Yeah, so I think the church definitely chooses, we definitely have very politically versed stances. That doesn't make sense. I think the church definitely chooses when to be political and when not to be political. And usually it's more of a neutral stance where we just call for peace and love and respect for all and whatnot. But yeah.
So why do you think that is? Why do you think the church kind of picks and chooses what things to talk about, what things to kind of stay away from?
I think it's usually when it's relevant to the time of day. And so, as things start to evolve and we're okay, these are topics that we need to talk more about and discuss more in Sunday school and whatnot, and have formulated opinions on, where the congregation doesn't really know what aligns with our Christian values as Orthodox Christians specifically. That's when the church kind of comes in and is yeah, this is where we stand and this is why we stand with it. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that you said it's more about the time of day. I would say it's a little bit more of, is it salvific? If it's something that pertains to our salvation, something that affects the salvation of the believers, I feel like the church has more of a reason, almost a necessity,
right,
to have an opinion on it. Where if it's something that's, just a political matter, right, or an economical matter, the church is not a company. The church is not a political party. So for it to, give opinions on that, I think it's just not, there's a time for everything, there's a place for everything.
Right.
And I just think that the church is not the place for politics specifically.
I definitely get your stance, but I also do think that, how you said, I do think, certain topics tend to rise at certain times because of its relevance to society at this time of day, and we choose the side that is benefits our salvation and what will bring us closer to Christ. But then again, I'm also but how would we even come to be talking about these topics unless they become relevant, or unless we start it's impacting our lives, or it's impacting the people around us, and kids are more curious, or just we're more curious, so
I definitely like you said, it has to come into relevancy. The church is not going to go talk about something that happened 500 years ago just for the sake of it. But not everything that becomes relevant has an opinion on it. And so I think where that line is drawn of what to pick and what to choose from is based on, what enhances the salvation and the spirituality of the believers and what doesn't really make a difference, I think. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. I definitely think there's a lot more things, though, that we tend to focus more on and that we sort of let slide, if that makes sense. And, that's something I've had to, have, my own, debacles with, when being okay, why do we care more about this and, less about, how this might affect us, and, whatnot. So, yeah.
I think the answer to that comes from the heritage and history of the church, the Coptic Church being a persecuted church and a church of martyrs, especially in a world where you pick up your faith and you move to a new country. You tend to be very protective over your beliefs, and you tend to be very shielded and overprotective of your beliefs, your morality. And so I think because of that, what that does is it forces the church to kind of almost be like a little cave, almost to kind of just be leave us alone, just kind of stay away from us. But that is how the church has operated politically for thousands of years in Egypt, since the Islamic Inquisition, which would be to just be just leave us alone, let us do our thing, and we won't mess with it. We're not, because there was no opportunity for Coptic people to be involved in any sort of political power. But in this country, there's a big importance on political empowerment, especially for minority groups. So how does the Coptic Church in America still keep the heritage and the humility of the ancient church that's saying, like, you know, just like leave us alone, let us do our thing, like that humble posture, while still doing what's right for the community of believers in advancing the political empowerment of the Coptic people?
Well, I don't think the church was ever like, leave us alone. I think we obviously are like, please don't persecute us. Not like, you know, but I don't think we were ever like quiet or like silent about like our beliefs for us to ever be like, leave us alone, you know? I think we're very loud and we're very vocal, and it just might not be with, like, I think also the church has opinions that like current day society doesn't agree with, but I don't think we're ever quiet about that. So I don't think I necessarily agree with the church being like a leave us alone kind of stance either. I think we're very strong in our faith, which is like where our martyrs like come from, and like that's, you know, like who we are as like a people, you know. And that's what I was saying. Sorry, what's the second part of the question?
Before I ask it, I'll
yeah.
I think the leave us alone is more of, it's not that we're quiet about it, it's that it's more of like, just like, if you don't persecute the church, we're not going to force any beliefs. We're not going to go into the public forum and be like, hey, listen, this is what we should do, this is what we shouldn't do. Right. And I think that's what the Coptic Church has done. Yeah. In the past, it's not necessarily like we'll stay quiet, but it was more of, you know, just let us do our thing. Yeah. Don't impede what we do. Yeah. And then we won't impede, you know, the greater regime of the Islamic nation that Egypt is a part of. Yeah. So the second part of the question was, here in America, that's different, right? We don't have a Islamic regime oppressing the Coptic people. It's quite the opposite. It's a very, you know, politically empowering country that pushes to instill confidence and power in minority groups. So how does the Coptic Orthodox Church keep that spirit of the ancient church, that humility, that, you know, like we don't want to push, you know, our beliefs outwards? We'll be a lighthouse, but we don't want to, you know, push our beliefs onto others. How do we keep that but still facilitate, you know, that political empowerment and exercise that right that we have in the Western world?
I think the church also advocates for like free will. I think also like the basis of our faith is like based on free will, and like our end goal and like our destination being like because of our own actions and whatnot. And so we also instill that in how we interact with others. Like, we're not going to force, again, like our opinions or like what we believe on like other people, which is like kind of where my own political opinions like kind of also like really come from, is I can believe what I believe, but I also don't think I can, again, like instill that in any sort of like political manner on anybody else where it regulates them in like a manner. And so I think even though we say like, okay, we believe this, but there's no way that we can exercise that power on you, and we don't want to exercise that power on you just because like that's not who we are as Christians. Like, we don't believe in faith by force. I think is how it's this sort of that same nature is kept alive. And also like we understand this persecution, and we understand this like life of being a minority and like in Egypt, and also having to come here and still like continuing to live that life. And so it's not something that we would ever want to instill in somebody else again, you know, or like other various groups.
So I had a podcast yesterday that was about law and faith. It talks about like where the connections are, you know, how faith kind of brings to birth law and all those things. And I feel like this is very similar because politics are a derivation of law. How do you think our faith plays a role in our political views, if it does at all?
Yeah, I think your faith shapes your values and like your ethics, which in turn shapes your political opinions and your views. And there's different directions where I feel like you could definitely take that and be like, well, I believe this, and I think that these laws should be instilled on everyone, or not should be instilled on everyone, but should be how, or like should be implemented essentially. But there's also another where you can be like, I believe this, but I also know that like not everyone does, and I can't force everyone to believe that. And so exercising more of like a choice and like decision, like in terms of like policies and laws, is also another way people like I've seen like taken. So yeah, I hope that answered the question.
Yeah. Do you think as an Orthodox Christian that we can, do you think that we can call ourselves as part of the church if we disagree with the church on certain political stances? Or do you think those are mutually exclusive?
I definitely think you still can. Like, I definitely think you can say I'm a Christian, or like I'm an Orthodox Christian specifically, and have these beliefs for yourself, but also understand that, like, again, like, not everyone believes in this, and not everyone has to, and I can't force them. That's not Christian, and that's not love, is to force anyone to believe in like the same things that you do. But having those sort of like ideals for yourself and like setting these standards for yourself and like your community is, I think, to the extent that you can do. But I don't think you can, again, force that on anyone else. Yeah.
The struggle that I have with that is that you think of the church as a body of members, and like your hand and your feet have to be on the same page, or they can't be working against each other or believe in different things or have different motives or goals or intuitions. And so that's where I struggle with that point that, sure, we have self-autonomy. And I think there's certain things that are just not salvific or don't have nothing to do with faith, like economics. There's certain aspects of economics that do, but there's a lot of aspects of economics that just, like, whether you believe in trickle-down economics or economics from the bottom up, like, that's not really a faith thing. But I do think there's a lot of things, especially when it comes to social policies, that are very tied to faith and very tied to, what people believe and what the church believes. And I struggle to see a world where, you can have a living, breathing church and a flourishing church where you have members of it divided against each other on these fundamental things that derive from faith, if that makes sense.
Yes. I think as a congregation, I do agree in the sense that like we should all be on the same page and like understand like why we believe in this, like what are our sources for this, and like why this like exemplifies like our ethics and like our values as Orthodox Christians. But again, to sort of like reiterate what I said, is that I don't think outside of the church it should be forced on anyone. I think through our actions it could attract like people like to sort of understand where we're coming from and like who we are. But I just don't think it's Christian to like force these beliefs on other people outside of the church. Like I do agree with you as like a body, like within like as in like a congregation, like we should continue to like reiterate what we believe in. But I think from outside of that, we can be as opinionated as we want to be. But I just don't think pushing these beliefs and these values on other people who clearly do not believe in the same thing and have their own formulated opinions with their own backed evidence, we should be forcing them, I think we can like have these conversations, and I think it's really good to have this like dialogue with other people, especially who don't believe in the same things that we do. But I do think things can get to like a middle ground or like a standing point where you're just like, I just don't agree with you and you just don't agree with me, and that's fine. We like don't see eye to eye. But I don't think being Christian is also like is a forceful nature,
Of course, I agree.
Yeah.
But there's also a very fine line between, having these discussions and showing your beliefs and then forcing your beliefs. So where is that line? How do you kind of deal with that? And how do you, make sure you don't really cross that line and you act in a Christian manner when like talking about, faith and politics?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know where I would find like I feel like it's pretty difficult. I think when it turns into like a discussion, honestly, I don't know. I don't know what I think.
So what I'll say is, I think the line, because everything we do as Christians should be done in love. So I think that where the line is where it is not done in love anymore. And I think that differs from person to person and relationship to relationship. I think within the church body, doing things in love, it's like, you see someone that you care about and you see them going down a path or going down an ideology that is not edifying, is not correct, is not truthful. If you really love them and if you really cared for them, you wouldn't just turn a blind eye and say, oh, but it's their life, that's their truth. You would be like, hey, listen, like the truth is the truth. This is what's right. This is what's wrong. Right. You have a decision to make. But where I see that differs in talking to people who or maybe outside of the body, or you don't have a close relationship with, is that it's not about the words you say, but it's about the actions you do. You know, it's about showing these people that Christ's love has nothing to do with what they believe and what I believe, but it has 100% to do with, you know, the life that I live and just being a light to those around me. And so I think that's where that line between, you know, having those positive, uplifting conversations and edifying conversations and talking about things in a meaningful way versus just like talking to talk and just arguing to argue. I think that's where that line is. Yeah. And I think as Christians, we have to really stay within those boundaries because there's a lot of like stereotypes or misconceptions about, you know, what Christianity is, what it's about. And so you don't help all those claims by, you know, being a douchebag or doing something you shouldn't do, you know? Yeah. 100%. That's where I would say the line is.
That's a really good point. So when you like say like the line, are you like referencing like a conversation between like you and like another like Coptic person, or like you and like someone outside of the church?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, that's what I was just saying, is that if it's me and another Coptic person, especially someone who I know or someone I've talked to before, the line is a lot deeper in, you know? The line of political correctness, which I hate that term, that's another story, is a lot deeper than what it would be if I talked to some random kid from school, you know? Yeah. And I think the reason why is because I share a commonality with this other person. And this commonality is the pursuit of holiness, you know, the pursuit for eternity. So I think that's kind of where that difference is.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I think I definitely agree where once the conversation kind of takes a turn where it's definitely more aggressive, and like how you said we're just arguing at this point just to argue, is where you're just like, well, nobody's going to benefit at the end of the day, is where I feel like you can draw that line, is where you're like, I'm not gaining anything, you're not gaining anything, we're not seeing eye to eye, and we're honestly just like spewing at each other, is where there isn't a lot of love, and this is honestly just like a lot of like, I just want to talk at this point just because I feel like I'm correct and have this sort of like feel like I have like a leg up from you at this point. Yeah, that's what I would say with that.
Yeah, and then what I would say as well is that, you know, the thing about discussions, especially discussions of when you're talking about things that pertain to people on such a personal level, is that if you realize that you are talking a lot more than listening, you should probably stop talking. Especially as Christians, and when you're talking to people who aren't Christian, a lot of times, you know, like you have to practice the fruit of the Spirit. You have to practice, you know, having that patience, having that long suffering, and listening. Because a lot of people, a lot of times, don't know why they disagree or don't know why they say the things they say, especially when it comes to political opinions, especially when it comes to social political opinions. And a lot of times all I have to do is hear them out. And when you hear them out, they realize that, okay, you're not just one of those stuck up dudes that goes and knocks on everyone's door and says like, have you read the Bible? But you're like a genuine form of who Christ is on earth. You are a lighthouse to those people. And so I think that's where that line in political discussion, you know, kind of is, especially as Christians, is, you know, am I edifying this person and myself, or am I just yapping? Am I just talking? You know?
I just don't think you can ever really have these discussions. Also, kind of, this might like segue some like a little bit, but I don't think you can really have these discussions either without like asking questions, which may seem like you're like going slightly off from like what the like church might like the church's like stance or like the opinion on like the topic. But I also like, I think to be able to have these conversations and to have like edifying dialogue, like how you said, you need to also sit with yourself and be like, why does the church believe this? And, you know, like sit with Abuna and like your father of confession, your spiritual guidance and stuff, and understand like why the church believes what it believes in, why we believe in it, and like backed evidence into like our like opinions, because like the church doesn't just believe things just to believe things. Like we're like very like scholarly, you know. And I just don't think you can have those conversations without like taking those like necessary steps to like get there, you know, because then it's not edifying, and it's not like we just won't reach like a good like conclusion or like middle ground, if anything, you know. it again will just be like spewing and just like yap and just yap. So
I definitely think education is extremely important, and not just education in the subject itself from a secular perspective, but also the spiritual education behind it.
Right.
Because as humans, we are physical and spiritual beings, and the church in its wisdom, if you look at the church services, have physical and spiritual aspects to them. It's not just one or the other.
Right.
So in the same way, when we approach anything, not just political discussions, but anything in our life, it should be taken with the approach of a physical and a spiritual aspect. And so I think that's the difference between Christianity and any other worldview on worldviews, is that Christians, true Christianity and proper Christianity, is that not only should these educations be feeding your secular mind, but they should be feeding your spiritual mind just as much, if not more.
Right.
And so that's where I feel like another difference between those two sides is that there's a bigger purpose than just the words that are being said.
Yeah, 100%.
Especially in discourse. So my next question for you stems to be a little bit about the perspectives of the church. A lot of times within church service, especially as younger individuals, we feel like we have a responsibility to speak out about things that we believe in, and to give our opinions on things, especially within groups that we create or ministries that we have a bigger footing in, stuff like that. So why do you think the church kind of makes sure that it has a well-defined stance on a political topic before it lets a ministry kind of talk about it, or before it encourages its youth to kind of go out and talk about it? Why do you think that is?
I think the world is so confusing, and and it's like scary, and there's so many opinions, and we're very easily and especially at that age, we're very easily changeable. I was trying to remember the word for shaped, but I couldn't remember it. But this is when we're forming our own opinions and our own thoughts, and and it's sort of just the groundwork for years to come. And so I think the church actually does a very good job in being this is what we believe in, and this is why we believe in it, and this is what we should be teaching to our kids in Sunday school, and reiterating multiple times in pre-servants, so that when these students who are taking pre-servants go out and are serving, they're teaching the church's actual beliefs. I think heresies, this is where heresies arise, is when people are confused and we don't really understand our beliefs and our stances on things, and a lot of formed opinions can be formed and spread, and then also shaped into other manners and whatnot. So
yeah, what that reminds me of is this contemplation on St. Athanasius, where St. Athanasius, he has the famous quote, if the world's against Christ, I'm against the world. And a lot of people give him credit for, backing the church against Nestorius, which is, obviously he did a fantastic job at. But what people forget a lot of times is that it wasn't just Athanasius that knew what he was talking about. It was the people of the church that fought for their beliefs and fought against, the heresies. And so in that same way, I think that, again, we talk about education, is extremely important, because if the youth of the church are just going out because of their passion, because of their zeal, and just saying whatever's on their mind, a lot of times you can misrepresent the Orthodox faith. And especially coming from a persecuted church as a minority of Christianity in America that has a very misconstrued view of Christianity, that's an extremely dangerous thing to just let kids loose and just say whatever they want to say. Which I think that's why that education and that investment into the patience and the waiting and making sure that it's meticulously drawn out and written out what the church's beliefs are. I think that's why it's extremely important to the Coptic Orthodox Church specifically.
Yeah.
So my next question to follow that up would be, sometimes us as youth or just people in general disagree with some of the things the church say. How do you deal with that disagreement? And what are some ways you can come to a positive conclusion if you disagree with certain things the church says?
Like me personally, if I disagree, or if
You can
like
do me personally,
youth
or
in
you personally,
general.
just in general, up to you.
Yeah.
Whatever you want.
Because it definitely took. I think I've been very like politically charged and like politically active like growing up, but I wouldn't say that my values from the church and like me growing up as a Coptic Christian don't align with my political activism and also like what I do believe in politically. I think that, you know, sorry, I just want to be like careful with my words, so I'm being like a little extra careful.
No worries.
But I think can you say the question one more time?
So a lot of times as people we disagree with things the church says, just like we disagree with any other institution.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, you're never going to agree with everything.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that disagreement? And what are some ways that you can, you know, come to a conclusion that, but agreeing with the church is pretty important,
right,
just because it's the basis of everything you believe in. So how do you kind of deal with the fact that maybe you have something personally you just don't agree with, and how do you kind of deal with that and, you know, get past that?
I think understanding or trying to like first like pinpoint why I disagree with why the church has a stance on something, or like what they're not why they have a stance, but like what their stance is, and like finding out like what aspect of this stance I disagree with to begin with, and seeing like, okay, why do I not feel like this aligns with my values and like what I believe in as a Coptic Christian, is kind of like where I first, like, again, because like to reiterate, like I do feel like I was always very like politically charged and like politically active growing up, and you know that first began with like the Egyptian Revolution and seeing like how like our own people, just like Egyptians in general, sort of like were very active and very politically charged during the time, was like a very like inspiring thing and like role to take on, and that's sort of, you know, it threw me into like a really deep rabbit hole of, you know, the church's history in terms of like persecution and discrimination. And that sort of started, I want to say, like in high school, where it really like heightened for me. And so I did find myself sort of being like, okay, wait, I do not necessarily agree with the church's stance on this specific topic. And so like segueing into that, and I really had to like take the time and sit down and like ask so many questions. I remember my Sunday school teachers would get so annoyed because I would just be like, okay, but why do we believe in this? And like, what about this? And like really just like give them like a lot of like hypotheticals with certain situations, like certain topics. But sort of tackling like what specifically, again, like from that stance I don't necessarily believe in, or like I'm not fully convinced on, and just like not being afraid to ask the questions. And like, thank God, like St. Mark's Church and just like all of the servants here in general are very wise and very like encouraging for these questions. And I, you know, hope it's like this, like broadly, like across like all of our churches, where we do like give our students like the space to question and to understand, just because I don't feel like we fully formulate our opinions and like have like a complete understanding and like knowledge of like certain opinions and stances without being able to like ask these questions, just because we're like, okay, I believe in this and like that's it, you know. But understanding like the whys behind it and being able to like have that space to ask questions is where I sort of navigated, you know, some of my disagreements at first. So
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly. It's about asking the why, the questions.
Yeah.
And asking questions is not necessarily a thing of doubt, but it's actually very important. It's vital to spiritual development, is asking questions, just like how asking questions is vital to academic development. And so I think it's very important that the church encourages people to ask why, and encourages people to, you know, dig deep and find out more and learn more, obviously through the church's guidance. And then I think the second thing is to realize that specifically the Coptic Orthodox Church has stood strong for 2,000 years. That's not like a light thing. That's not something to take lightly. Yeah. And the fact that it stood for 2,000 years, and that it has gone through more than any other, not more than any other faith group, but more than any other Christian faith group in those 2,000 years, I think is a testament to the truth and the validity of it. And so you will never be the first person to ask that question, and you will definitely never be the last. Yeah. But your question's already been answered, and it's been vetted out through thousands of years of church fathers and of, you know, trials and tribulations. So if you come to a point where you just think you cannot agree with the church fundamentally, I think that speaks more to the fundamental development of your spirituality and your worldview than it does to the churches. And I think that becomes a pride thing, where a lot of times we take this pride in ourselves. We're like, oh, we know better, we know more.
Yeah.
We even see this just like with us, with our parents.
Yeah.
You know, we think we know better, we think we know more. But what we fail to realize is that experience has a lot of wisdom in it.
Yeah.
You know, it might not be a complete, it might not be a complete substitute for knowledge, but there's a lot of wisdom that comes with, you know, time. And so I think that by realizing that and realizing that, you know, I am not all that smart, I am not all that intelligent, you know, I'm not that guy, or, you know, I'm just not like that. I think that's kind of, you know, that humility is where that starts. It reminds me of a quote from St. Anthony that says, the only way to defeat the enemy is through humility. That's it. The only way to get those negative thoughts out of your head, or to stop those sins, or to stop doing these things, or stop, you know, these habits, is through humility. And that's it. And so I think that a lot of times, and there's a reason why these questions come up in our youth, come up, you know, when we're in our, you know, late high school, college years, is because we are given this pride. We have this pride inside of us that we think that we're educated or we know more. And so I think it's that humility is, you know, kind of how we break through that barrier of kind of putting our own opinions and beliefs above the church's. If that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely does. I do want to play devil's advocate and
Go for
say
it.
that, like, I don't, and I say this because I feel like I honestly, like, grew up privileged that I had these servants who were very, like, willing and, like, approached my questions with, like, a lot of, like, grace and, like, love. But I've also, like, heard from, like, other cops, like, outside of, like, my church, where they're like, I asked these questions and it was like answered with, like, a lot of, like, aggression and whatnot, and, like, not out of, like, a place of love and, like, okay, I see why you're curious. You know, take, like, from, like, the servant's perspective, like, talking to, like, like, their students, being like, okay, I see why you're curious, and, like, why this is, like, now, like, a topic that's, like, risen. And so I don't feel like everyone is given the space to ask these questions, though, you know, where then it turns into more of, like, okay, well, now I'm embarrassed, and now I feel like I'm not knowledgeable, and in turn I'll just, like, keep quiet, you know, instead of, like, asking these questions. So I don't feel like all of us are really given that space that, like, I just, like, thank God, like, had, like, the blessing of, like, you know, having, you know, like, in my community. So
I agree.
don't know, you know.
I agree 100%. I think that you're right. There's not everyone is given that. But with a lot of issues that we see in churches, you have to separate the church from the people who serve in the church.
Right, yeah, 100%.
And it's very hard to do that, especially when you're 16, 17, asking these questions. But you have to realize that the church in and of itself is perfect. The church by itself as an institution is perfect because it was instituted by Christ. Whether people within the church are perfect, the answer is no. And do they do things they shouldn't do? 110%. You know, I serve 4th and 5th grade Sunday school. Am I Christ to them? I try to be. Do I fail? Every single week. But it's not like, I think that's where the humanity has to come in. And that's part of that humility is realizing, or, like, giving that excuse to others, realizing that obviously it's hard, especially when you're the one asking the question. But it's realizing that, you know, maybe this servant is having a bad day or this or that. And they don't mean it in that way. They don't mean to be demeaning. And on the flip side, as a servant, it's not, oh, this kid's trying to question the church, or this kid's trying to question my knowledge or my authority or anything. But they're just genuinely curious, and they genuinely just want to know. So I think that's a two-way street, but I also think that has a lot to do with just the people in the church. And I think that stems from the persecuted mindset, which is like, don't question my beliefs, don't start attacking us, when in reality it's not necessarily an attack. And so I think that relates to my question about how should the Orthodox Church in the future deal with political empowerment and deal with political involvement? Because the church, especially the Coptic Orthodox Church, I like to keep it specific just because, but the Coptic Orthodox Church specifically is at this crossroads where you have these huge communities, for example, like in Jersey or in Nashville, where a good percentage of the population of the people who live there are Coptic, and they have no representation. And so I think that kind of relates back to that crossroads of, well, what does the church do? Does the church take on a little bit more of a political role? Is it indirect? Is it more direct? What do they do? Because at the same time, you don't want to become a political entity. So I think that kind of relates back, which is, getting away from the persecuted mindset, but still keeping the humility of the persecuted mindset. And so I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. Wait, can you reiterate like what you mean about getting away from the persecuted mindset? Because I feel like that's like the basis of our faith. So I feel like we should never get away from the persecuted mindset and being like, okay, this is.
I'm not saying forget the fact that we were persecuted and forget the heritage behind it. What I mean is remove ourselves from this mindset that everyone is against us and everyone's attacking us.
Like victimization.
Yeah, removing that because it's just not true anymore. That was true in the past and it's not anymore. And to live or to exist in the Western world in that way cannot help it just does not help the church in any way. And I think there is push to kind of remove ourselves from that and to, instead of being a lighthouse that has a little bit of a window open just for just because we don't want to be seen too much. We have the full window open. We show everyone the light that we have. And so I guess my question was more of asking, do you see that happening, that light being shown in a political way at all? Or do you see that kind of just staying as how it is and just more of a spiritual way? That was kind of where I was going with that.
Yeah. Sorry, can you define like the light that you mean?
So,
I'm a little confused by the question.
So the church or the people in the church supposed to be lighthouses. So lighthouses have two functions.
Yeah.
To have a light and to have an open window. So the more you open the window, the more people will see the light. But lighthouses never like yell at ships and tell them to come. So there's no forcing. But in let's go back to 1800s. The lighthouse, the window was a lot smaller because it had to be because of the circumstances of, the Egyptian culture at the time. But now that we're in America, we have the ability to open up, all the windows of the lighthouse. So we are doing that from a spiritual perspective in the Western world. Do you see a time or a place in the future where that shifts into a political enlightenment as well? Or do you kind of see that the church kind of just stays away from that?
Let me think. I think the church should encourage members to at least have opinions and to be very strong in these opinions and have very strong stances. I think when you do have an opinion, you should at least understand where this opinion comes from and be very loud about it when given the opportunity, not to be in everyone's face or anything, but to know where you're coming from and why you're coming from it. And so I feel like the church should encourage this, and I feel like that comes from knowledge. And I know we talked a bit about that, but I think this is kind of a hard question, to be honest. It's a little difficult, but I think right now the church sort of is a bit neutral, and because in instances where I don't think we are fully 100% in one place or fully 100% in another place, I feel like the church usually does take the more of. Hold on. Can I get your stance on it first? Because I feel a little.
So what I'll say is, I think the church has to stay neutral.
Yeah.
We're talking about broad political spectrum. So we're talking about in general.
Yeah.
We're not talking about specific topics, but in general, because the church is not a political entity. The church is a hospital for sick people.
Right.
Sorry. And hospitals should not be political entities. Whether they are or not is a completely different story. But the point being is that the church is just there to accept people and then to transform their lives through Christ. And that's it. It's not there to tell people, well, this is how you should think. This is how you should do your taxes. This is how you should take advantage of this law. That's not how the church operates. However, do I think that people within the church should pursue political careers? Yes, and there's two reasons why. The first reason is I think that the political system is very corrupt as is. And the only way to get rid of corruption is by inserting in corrupt, strong-willed people who are not going to deviate. That's the first reason. The second reason is I think that if you look at history and you look at the political spectrum, it's a pendulum. It goes from one extreme to the other. And right now we are at one extreme, and it's slowly starting to fall down, and it will quickly swing back in the other direction. And so the thing is that Orthodoxy, a lot of people think it's a very extreme way of thinking. It's not. Orthodoxy is theologically, socially, canonically, the middle of Christianity. It is literally the most neutral in terms of all aspects of Christian values and virtues. And so the middle is important, right? If you think about like a Newton's, what are they called? Whatever they're called. You know what I'm talking about. Like the things where you like,
physics.
you have the balls and let go, right?
I know
What happens over time? It meets in the middle.
Yeah.
So in that same way, the church has to become an anchor for the middle, as an anchor for people to not be on either extreme. There is a straight path, there is a middle path. That's orthodoxy. So I think those are the two main reasons why I would say, why the church should not be political, but the people in the church should invest politically, because I feel like that would benefit society, and we're called to benefit society and to help the world, because we're called to be successful, not just called to be losers and don't do anything.
Right. So then if we do, I 100% agree that we should push our members to become members in politics and whatnot, and also just, I don't think you necessarily also have to take that role to a formal role,
Of course,
or
yeah,
position,
of course,
to be political. I don't. That's kind of
politically
the wrong.
active.
Yeah, politically active. I personally think everyone should, and I think it affects you in one way or another, whether or not you think. I think politics inevitably does affect everyone at the end of the day, and so I think being knowledgeable and having your own formulated opinions is very, very important, and doesn't need to be taken up in a very formal space or role to do that. This is very interesting, because I was actually talking to Nabuna about this, because again, how I was saying, I think I grew up very politically active and very outspoken, and so kind of was talking to him about the debacle between that, and being okay, well, some of my opinions don't necessarily, or no, sorry, that's not correct, my things I would want to do now, since the church isn't taking formal stances on the specific topic that I was that was more relevant at the time. I mean, still is relevant right now, but it was sparked at the time. Wanting to take a stance and an opinion on that, me personally, but also knowing that I'm a member of the church and do reflect, am a reflection of the church.
You're an ambassador of Christ. That's what St. Paul calls us.
Oh, that's I like that. Okay, yeah. I actually have never heard that before. An ambassador of Christ. So yeah, and so I was talking to a priest about this, and I sort of actually goes back to what you were saying about us having being more neutral and being an anchor. He sort of said if there were two different opinions, two different stances, Christ always took the third option, or the third stance. And I thought that was really interesting, and he never was it's either this or this. He was no, what's the third option, what's the third middle ground that we can all sort of reach to. And because I always saw Christ as someone who's very outspoken,
but I think a lot of times we misrepresent outspoken for extreme,
right? And I don't think you need to. I think to be outspoken, I personally don't see those correlating. I think to be outspoken just means to be opinionated. And I think
you think about what people, when you say that person's opinionated, a lot of times the subconscious is that's an extreme person,
right. Yeah.
But that's not necessarily true.
Yeah, I see. I would say I'm outspoken and I'm opinionated. I just think, but I wouldn't say my opinions are extreme necessarily. I would just say I'm a bit more vocal.
Yeah.
About them, and I think that's where more the outspoken aspect comes to play. And I think Christ was always outspoken, and Christ did not hide, and I think he, if any, yeah. But I don't want to be oh, Christ was so politically active. I know the church is not Christ was not political, but. Well,
I think there's a time and place for everything, right? And
yeah,
there's a
100%.
discernment of when to speak, when not to speak.
1,000%.
Yeah. For example, if you're at a frat party and someone's bringing up a political debate, that might, first off, okay, well, that's a bad example, but first off, you shouldn't be there, but in the first place, but let's say you happen to be there.
On a frat.
Maybe that's not the best place to talk about, to bring, to engage in that conversation. But if you're, just like with a friend and they ask you, hey, like, what are your thoughts on this? And you can tell they're just they're curious and they want to know, maybe that's the time for it. Maybe that's when you plant that seed. But I think it comes with discernment. So I think it's not about just like, oh, like everyone needs to just talk all the time about everything. And, no, there's a time and a place for it. And also not everyone is for that. Like St. Paul says, some are teachers, some are preachers, some are evangelists, some are prophets, some are ministers, some are whatever. So every single person has a role. And I think that's also important, and realizing the humility and realizing that maybe I don't need to be the one to speak. Even the people who do speak, maybe don't need to speak all the time. So I think, again, it goes back to that humility we keep talking about.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, I definitely do agree. And I mean, Christ was like the wisest of the wise. Like, there is no one wiser, So he, again, with that discernment, like, picked and chose his battles, like, very, very wisely. But, like, and this is, I don't know, I think this is very interesting because when Christ did, like, speak very loudly, like, it was usually against the Pharisees. And, like, at that time, like, the Pharisees were, like...
Well, I think it was the corrupt nature of the Pharisees.
Correct, but the Pharisees were the politics at the time. Like, even though, like, they were, like, the religious stances, like, they were at, like the law figures,
Of course.
And so I think sort of taking that same nature and, like, how you said that Christ attained, or Christ, like, had, and, like, emulating that, like, in our own lives, and speaking out against, like, corruptness, which is, I feel like, like, most of, like, my political stances, like, line, obviously, and, like, as a minority group, we're very well versed in this nature, and being able to take that and... Sorry, I don't know where I'm going with this, to be honest. But
I think the common theme of this entire conversation is wisdom and humility.
Of course.
So, to wrap this up, there's a fraction called the fraction of wisdom by Saint Epiphanius, and I'm just going to read a small part of it. So it says, "Wisdom has counsel, might, and knowledge. By wisdom kings reigned, the great men are honored, and the princes of the earth govern. Wisdom loves those who love her, and protects those who keep her. Those who seek wisdom find grace. Wisdom walks in the way of justice and moves in the path of truth. Wisdom grants richness to those who acknowledge her and fills her treasures with joy." So I think the takeaway from that is that it's about the wisdom, and that if you invest in that wisdom, like it says, by wisdom kings reigned. So through that wisdom, and it's uppercase W, so it's talking about Christ, it's embodying Christ as wisdom, that it's only through Christ, and it's only through that wisdom and through that discernment and through that humility that you can change the world. It's not about those political powers. Even if you have those, it's not about that. It's about, that aspect, the internal man. It's not about the external man. So I think that's kind of the biggest takeaway, which is, it's not about what we say or what we do or what we, it's about who are we on the inside? What is the internal person? Well, that's all I have. If you have anything else you want to say, go for it.
No, that's it. I don't really have much to say. That was it.
Thank you, Ann, for coming on to the podcast. Thank you guys for watching.
Me.
Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Turn on post notifications, and see you guys next week.
Bye, guys.